At 45, Percy Stillman had achieved everything an average middle-class American man could dream of. His construction company, Stillman Construction, held contracts for half of River City's major projects, from shopping malls to residential complexes. The mansion in the prestigious Oakland Hills neighborhood where his family lived was worth $1.5 million. His wife, Stacy, was one of the most successful realtors at the elite agency Premium Estate, and their children, 16-year-old Brandon and 14-year-old Emily, attended the best private school in town. Every morning, Percy woke up at 6, drank his coffee while reading the Wall Street Journal, kissed his wife goodbye, and drove to his office on the 30th floor of the River Tower. In the evening, he would return home for dinner with his family, help his children with their homework, and watch the news. On weekends, he played golf at a country club. But twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, Percy didn't go home after work. Instead, he parked his black BMW X7 in the underground garage of the River Plaza Shopping Center and walked 3 blocks to the Metropole Bar in the city's business district. The Metropole was the place where young professionals came after work, lawyers from nearby offices, bankers, middle managers. The modern interior, subdued lighting, expensive alcohol, and jazz music created an atmosphere of elegant anonymity that Percy liked so much. Jason Reyes worked behind the bar, 28 years old, dark hair, always clean-shaven, with a charming smile that made customers leave generous tips. Jason had moved to River City 3 years ago from Detroit, where he had worked in several restaurants before deciding to try his luck in a bigger city. They met a year and a half ago. Percy walked into the Metropole after a particularly difficult day. A $15 million deal had fallen through due to city planning issues. Jason noticed his gloomy mood and, handing him a whiskey, said, "You look like the world is falling on your shoulders." They struck up a conversation. At first, they were just casual conversations at the bar. Jason was a good listener and never asked too many personal questions. Gradually, Percy began to come more often, staying until closing time. One evening last March, when there were no other customers left in the bar, Jason suggested, "Why don't we continue this conversation at my place?" Jason's apartment was in a modern residential complex called Riverview, 10 minutes drive from downtown. It was a modest one-bedroom apartment on the 8th floor with a view of the Grand River, which flowed through the city. It was there, in that apartment, that something happened between them that Percy could never fully explain to himself. He had been married for 20 years. He had never had any problems with women. But when Jason kissed him that March evening, something clicked inside him, as if a part of his personality that he had kept locked away his entire life had suddenly burst forth. Since then, their meetings had become regular. But every time it was time to go home to Stacy and the kids, reality hit him with the same force as before. In River City, he was Percy Stillman, a construction magnate, a family man, a member of the Chamber of Commerce, a sponsor of charitable events, a man who couldn't afford to be gay. Stacy began to suspect that something was wrong about 6 months ago. At first, it was small things. He started staying late at work more often, had sex with her less often, and sometimes she noticed unfamiliar scents of perfume on his clothes. She thought he was having an affair with his secretary or a client and tried to talk to him about it several times. Percy denied everything, explaining his delays by saying he had a growing workload and was stressed. The only person who knew Jason's secret was his best friend, Thomas Harris. Thomas ran a chain of fast-fill gas stations and had lived in River City for 10 years. They met when Jason first moved to town, and Thomas helped him find a job and an apartment. Jason never mentioned the name of his secret lover, saying only that he was an influential married man in business. Thomas disapproved of the relationship, believing it would lead to nothing good, but he was a good enough friend not to lecture him. Meanwhile, Detective Michael O'Connor of the River City Police Department's Homicide Division was busy with routine cases. In his 12 years on the force, he had seen it all, from domestic violence in working-class neighborhoods to financial crimes in the business district. O'Connor was a good cop, attentive to detail and patient in his investigations. His divorce 3 years earlier had taught him not to trust outward appearances of family happiness. On that October evening when this story began, none of these people had any idea how closely their lives would become intertwined in just a few weeks. Percy kissed Stacy goodnight, thinking about his meeting with Jason the next day. Jason browsed cooking websites, dreaming of his own restaurant. Stacy lay awake, wondering how to find out the truth about her husband's infidelity. O'Connor read his daughter a bedtime story, while Thomas watched football on TV. None of them knew that in a month's time, one of them would be dead and the rest would be embroiled in a murder investigation that would rock River City. The November rains had turned the streets of River City into gray streams of water and mud. Jason Reyes stood at the window of his apartment, holding a stack of bills in his hands and staring at the murky Grand River below. The red numbers on his credit card statements seemed to burn before his eyes. $15,847 on his MasterCard, $8,223 on his Visa, and another $12,000 in personal loans from First National Bank. Over the past 6 months, his financial situation had deteriorated dramatically. First, his car broke down, an old Honda Accord he had bought used in Detroit. The repairs cost $3,000. Then his mother fell ill in Detroit, and Jason had to pay part of her medical bills, another $5,000. And in August, the manager of the Riverview apartment complex raised the rent by $200 a month. The bartender's salary at the Metropole, even with tips, barely covered his monthly expenses. Jason worked part-time on weekends at a catering company, but that didn't solve the problem of growing debts. Every month, he could only pay the minimum amount on his loans, and the interest was eating up more and more of his money. The worst part was that his dream of opening his own restaurant now seemed completely out of reach. Jason had already found the perfect place, a small space on Main Street in the historic center of town, where an old bookstore used to be. The rent was $4,000 a month, but he needed at least $100,000 for renovations, equipment, and startup capital. On Friday evening, after the Metropolis closed, Jason and Percy sat on the couch in his apartment, drinking wine. Outside, the city lights were burning, reflecting in the raindrops on the window. "I have an offer for a restaurant," Jason said, trying to sound confident. He told Percy about the space on Main Street and his plans to create a restaurant serving modern American cuisine and signature cocktails. Percy listened attentively, nodding occasionally. Jason spoke with such enthusiasm that his eyes literally lit up. But when the conversation turned to finances, Percy frowned. $100,000 is a lot of money, he said cautiously. "I'm not asking for the whole amount right away," Jason replied quickly. "Maybe $25,000 to start with, to put a deposit on the place and start renovating. I'll find the rest myself somehow." Percy was silent, twirling his wine glass in his hands. He knew that $25,000 wasn't that much money for him. Last week, he had spent $40,000 on a new car for Stacy. But giving Jason money meant deepening their relationship even more, making it more serious and permanent. "Let's talk about it later," he said finally. "I need to think about it." Jason nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. He had expected a more enthusiastic response. Over the year and a half they had been together, Percy had given him money several times, paid for car repairs, helped with his mother's medical bills. But it had never been such a large sum. Meanwhile, in the mansion in Oakland Hills, Stacy Steelman was awake. It was already midnight, and Percy still hadn't returned. This was the second time this week. On Monday, he had come home at 11:30, explaining that he had been delayed by a meeting with potential investors. Stacy got out of bed and went to the window. Their bedroom was on the second floor, and she could see the driveway from there. Percy's BMW wasn't in the parking lot. She picked up the phone and called him. "Where are you?" she asked when Percy answered. "At the office, finishing up some paperwork for the River Park project. I'll be home in half an hour." he replied. Stacy knew he was lying. There was none of the tension and exhaustion in his voice that usually came when Percy was really working late. Besides, she could hear soft music playing in the background, clearly not office music. The next morning, at breakfast, Stacy watched her husband closely. Percy looked rested and even slightly pleased, which was strange after a supposedly hard night at work. "How did the meeting with the investors go?" she asked casually, spreading butter on her toast. Percy hesitated for a second. "Fine. We discussed financing for a new shopping center on the east side." "What are the names of these investors?" Stacy continued. "A group from Chicago, Millennium Development." Stacy nodded and didn't ask any more questions. But after Percy left for work and the children went to school, she sat down at her computer and started searching. There was no Millennium Development Company in Chicago. That same day, Stacy made a decision. She hired a private investigator. Frank Collins was an experienced detective with 30 years of experience in the River City Police Department, and for the last 5 years, he had been working as a private investigator. A gray-haired man in his 50s, he specialized in family matters, infidelity, alimony, missing persons. "Are you sure you want to know the truth?" he asked Stacy during their meeting in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. "Sometimes the truth is more painful than suspicion." "I have to know," Stacy replied firmly. "I have 2 children, a home, a business. I can't build my life on a lie." Collins took a $1,000 advance and promised results within a week. On Monday evening, Jason brought up the subject of money again. They were having dinner at Mario's, a small Italian restaurant 10 minutes from downtown, one of the few places in town where Percy felt relatively safe from chance encounters with acquaintances. "The landlord said that if I don't pay the deposit by the end of the month, he'll rent it to someone else," Jason said, cutting his pasta with a fork. "There are already 2 other people interested." Percy saw the desperation in Jason's eyes. Over the course of their relationship, he had grown accustomed to his usual confidence and optimism. Now Jason looked hounded. "How about $15,000 to start with?" Jason suggested. "I'm willing to sign any papers, pay it back with interest." "It's not about the money," Percy said quietly. "The thing is, it's hard to hide such large sums from my wife. She controls all our finances. What if we make it a business deal, an investment in the restaurant business?" Percy shook his head. "Stacy is too smart. She'll know something's wrong right away." That evening, they parted on somewhat cold terms. Jason felt rejected, and Percy felt guilty for not being able to help the man he loved. Meanwhile, private investigator Collins had been following Percy for 3 days. He had recorded visits to the metropolis, trips to the Riverview residential complex, and dinner at Mario's. The picture was still incomplete, but Collins felt that everything would soon fall into place. On Wednesday evening, Thomas Harris stopped by Jason's place after work. His friend looked depressed, sitting on the couch with a can of beer, staring at the TV. "Problems with your secret lover?" Thomas asked bluntly. Jason told him about his conversation with Percy and the failed attempt to help with the restaurant. "Maybe it's time to end the relationship?" Thomas suggested. "The guy is married, he has a reputation, children. He'll never leave everything for you." "I'm not asking him to leave his family," Jason replied irritably. "I just want to build a life of my own, and he could help." "What if he doesn't?" Jason was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "Then maybe he'll have to choose between helping me and keeping his secrets." Thomas looked at his friend with concern. There was something new in his voice, something like a threat. November 23rd was particularly cold for River City. Early snow covered the streets in a thin layer, turning the city into a black and white photograph. Jason Reyes sat in the office of the manager of First National Bank and listened to what he had been afraid to hear for several months. "Mr. Reyes, you are 60 days behind on your personal loan payments," said the manager, a 50-year-old man in a strict suit. The bank will be forced to refer your case to a collection agency if you do not pay the outstanding balance in full within 10 days. The debt had grown to $14,500, including penalties and interest. Jason had $420 in his account. "Is there any possibility of restructuring?" he asked, knowing full well the answer. The manager shook his head. "You've already asked for 2 extensions. Unfortunately, the bank can't accommodate you any further." As he left the bank, Jason felt the world crumbling around him. An unpleasant surprise awaited him in the parking lot. A $75 parking ticket was displayed on the windshield of his Honda. He crumpled the ticket and threw it in a trash can. That evening, at the Metropole, Jason had trouble concentrating on his work. He mixed up orders, broke 2 glasses, and poured gin instead of vodka in a customer's martini. Bar manager Richard Clark took him aside at the end of his shift. "Jace, what's going on with you? You've been working here for 3 years and you've never been so distracted." "I'm sorry, Rick. Personal problems. It won't happen again." "I hope so. We've got the corporate party season coming up, and I need everyone on their game." That night, Jason couldn't sleep until 4 in the morning. He lay in bed counting his debts. Bank, credit cards, rent, utilities. The total was close to $40,000. With his salary, that meant several years of living hand-to-mouth with no hope of ever starting his own business. The next day, Thomas Harris stopped by Jason's desk during his lunch break. They sat in a small cafe called City Light next to Thomas's gas station. "You look terrible," Thomas said, studying his friend's face. "What happened?" Jason told him about his visit to the bank and the threat from the debt collectors. Thomas listened silently, shaking his head occasionally. "Maybe you should try to find a side job, or move to a cheaper apartment." "Tom, you don't understand. I'll be 30 next year. If I don't open a restaurant now, I'll never do it. I'll be pouring cocktails for drunk businessmen for the rest of my life." "What about your married friend? Can't he help?" Jason smiled bitterly. "He's afraid his wife will find out about his spending. $25,000 is pocket change to him, but it's my lifeline. He'd rather keep his perfect marriage intact." There was such anger in Jason's voice that Thomas felt uneasy. "Jace, you're not thinking of doing something stupid, are you?" "Like what?" "Putting pressure on him, threatening him." Jason was silent for a long time, stirring his coffee with a spoon. "What if he realizes that losing me will cost him much more than giving me money?" "That's blackmail, Jace, and it's a crime. It's justice." Meanwhile, private investigator Collins had gathered enough evidence for Stacy's preliminary report. Photos of Percy entering the Riverview apartment complex, records of his visits, pictures of them having dinner together at Mario's. It all pointed to an affair. All that remained was to find out who the mistress was. Collins spent several days observing the residents of the 8th floor of Riverview, where Percy spent his time. Most of the residents were young professionals, lawyers, managers, teachers. But apartment 8B was occupied by a young man who worked as a bartender at the Metropole. A strange choice for a married millionaire's mistress. On Friday evening, Collins got the answers to his questions. He watched from his car as Percy Stillman hugged and kissed Jason Reyes at the entrance to the apartment complex. The detective quickly took several pictures with his telephoto lens. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. In 30 years on the job, he had seen all kinds of family dramas, but a gay affair involving an influential businessman promised to be particularly painful. On Sunday, November 26th, Jason made his final decision. He called Percy and asked to meet. "I can't today," Percy replied. "We're having a family dinner with Stacy's parents. It's important, very important." Something in Jason's voice made Percy agree. They met at 7 in the evening in Riverside Park, on a bench by the frozen river. The place was deserted in such weather, and they could talk openly. "I need $50,000, Jason said without preamble. Percy sighed. "Jace, we've already discussed this. I can't." "You can. You just don't want to." "It's not about wanting to. It's impossible to hide that kind of money. Stacy will see it and start asking questions. Jason took an envelope out of his pocket and handed it to Percy. Inside were photographs, the two of them at the entrance to Riverview, having dinner at Mario's, holding hands in Percy's car. "Looks like someone's already asking questions," Jason said calmly. Percy turned pale as he looked at the pictures. "Where did you get these? It doesn't matter. What matters is that if these photos get to your wife, to the newspapers, to your business partners, your career is over. So is your marriage." "Are you blackmailing me?" Percy's voice sounded incredulous. "I'm offering you a mutually beneficial deal. You give me $50,000 and I'll disappear from your life forever." "And if I refuse?" Jason shrugged. "A reporter from the River City Times is very interested in the story of the secret life of one of the city's most influential businessmen. Can you imagine the headlines?" Percy got up from the bench and paced back and forth, trying to cope with the shock. The man he had loved for a year and a half, whom he had trusted with his most intimate secrets, was now threatening to destroy his life. On Monday morning, Stacy received a call from Collins. "I need to show you something. I'm afraid it's not good news." They met at the same cafe where they had first arranged to meet. Collins silently handed Stacy a folder of photographs. Stacy looked at the photos for a long time, and with each one, her face became more and more stony. She was prepared for infidelity, but not this. Her husband was gay. 20 years of marriage, 2 children, a public reputation, all built on a lie. "Who is he?" she finally asked. "Jason Reyes, 28 years old, bartender at the Metropole, moved here from Detroit 3 years ago." "What else do you know about him?" "He has debts, dreams of opening a restaurant, lives alone, has a close friend, Thomas Harris, a gas station manager." Stacy closed the folder. "How much do I owe you?" "Another $1,500 for the work." She wrote a check and stood up. "Thank you. I won't be needing your services anymore." "Mrs. Stillman, if I may offer some advice, think carefully before you do anything. Cases like this rarely end well for everyone involved." But Stacy had already left the cafe, clutching the folder with the photos. That evening, Thomas met Jason again. His friend seemed strangely excited, almost euphoric. "I've solved the money problem," he announced. "How?" "My married friend finally realized that helping me is in his own best interest." Thomas felt a chill in his stomach. "Jace, tell me you haven't done anything stupid." Jason smiled, but it was a cold smile. Thomas realized that his best friend had crossed a line of no return, and that scared him more than he was willing to admit. Monday morning, December 4th, began with the screams of the manager of the Riverview apartment complex. Roger McIntyre, a 60-year-old war veteran, had been managing the building for 8 years and had seen it all. But when he entered apartment 8B at the request of neighbors complaining about loud music that had been playing all night, his military training was of no help. Jason Reyes was lying face down on the living room floor in a pool of blood. There was a deep wound on the back of his head. Next to him lay a heavy glass vase that usually stood on the coffee table, now covered in blood and hair. McIntyre immediately called the police. 15 minutes later, 3 patrol cars and a detective car pulled up to the apartment complex. Detective Michael O'Connor was one of the first to arrive. O'Connor examined the crime scene with professional thoroughness. The apartment was in disarray: overturned chairs, scattered documents, open drawers. But it didn't look like a robbery. The TV, computer, and expensive watches were untouched. "Time of death?" he asked the arriving medical examiner doctor, Susan Parker. "Preliminary estimate is between 10 p.m. Sunday and 2 a.m. Monday. Cause of death is traumatic brain injury from a blunt object." O'Connor nodded, examining the broken vase. "Murder weapon?" "Most likely. I'll send it to the lab for analysis." The detective began questioning the neighbors. Most hadn't heard anything. It was Sunday evening, and many were at home watching television. but the tenant across the hall, an elderly woman named Evelyn Gray, had been observant. "Around 10:30, I heard someone talking loudly in his apartment," she told O'Connor. "Jason and someone else. The voices sounded tense, as if they were arguing." "Did you recognize the second voice?" "No, but it was a man. And he spoke intelligently, not like Jason's usual visitors." "Did you see who came to see Mr. Reyes?" Mrs. Gray looked a little embarrassed. "Well, sometimes a man in an expensive suit would come to see him. He was elegant, in his 40s. He drove a black BMW. O'Connor wrote down all the details. "When was the last time you saw him?" "Last Friday, I think. They were having dinner together. I saw them through the window." The detective returned to the victim's apartment and took a closer look at the documents scattered on the floor. In a desk drawer, O'Connor found something interesting, an envelope with photographs. The pictures showed a middle-aged man in a business suit hugging and kissing someone out of frame at the entrance to a residential complex. In other photos, the same man was sitting in a restaurant across from a person whose face was hidden. "Interesting," the detective muttered as he studied the photos. The man in the photos looked familiar, but O'Connor couldn't immediately remember where he had seen him before. The victim's phone was lying on the kitchen table. The last calls were on Sunday, several missed calls from Thomas Harris, and one short call at 7 p.m. from an unknown number. O'Connor decided to start with Thomas Harris. They met at the Fast Fill gas station office on East Street. Thomas looked shaken by the news of his friend's death. "I tried to call him last night," he said, nervously crumpling a paper coffee cup. "I wanted to know how the meeting with his friend went." "What meeting?" Thomas hesitated. "Jason didn't give me any details. He just said he was dealing with some important financial matters." "Mr. Harris, your friend is dead. If you know anything, now is the time to talk." Thomas was silent for a long time, then sighed heavily. Jason had been seeing a married man for the past year and a half, someone influential in the business world. Jason had debts and wanted to open a restaurant, but this man refused to help him. And Jason threatened to tell everyone about their relationship if he didn't get the money. $50,000 as of yesterday. O'Connor wrote down every word. "Do you know the name of this man?" Jason never said. He only said that he was very rich and afraid of scandal. "Describe what you know about him." "Construction business, large family, respected in the city, drives a black BMW." The description matched Mrs. Gray's account. O'Connor showed Thomas photos from the victim's apartment. "Is this him?" asked the detective, pointing to a man in a suit. Thomas nodded. "He looks like the guy I saw a couple of times from a distance when I stopped by Jason's place." Meanwhile, news of the murder spread throughout the city. At the Metropole, manager Richard Clark told the police about Jason's last days at work. "He was very nervous last week," Clark said. "He mixed up orders and broke dishes. I thought he was having money problems. He asked for an advance several times." "Did any of the regular customers interact with Mr. Reyes particularly often?" "There was one man who came in on Tuesdays and Fridays. He always sat at the far table and ordered whiskey. Jason served him personally, and they talked for a long time." "Describe him." "About 45 years old, well-dressed, expensive watch. He looked like a successful businessman. He paid cash and left big tips." At the Steelman's mansion in Oakland Hills, Stacy learned about the murder from the morning news. She was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, watching the local channel, when she heard the name Jason Reyes and saw a photo of a young man she recognized from the detective's pictures. Percy hadn't come down for breakfast yet. The children had left for school. Stacy went up to her bedroom and knocked on the bathroom door. "Percy, have you heard the news?" "What news?" came the reply from behind the door. "The guy in your photos has been killed. Jason Reyes." There was a long pause. Then Stacy heard the sound of soap or a razor falling. "What did you say?" Percy's voice was shaking. "Jason Reyes was found dead in his apartment. The police are calling it a murder." Another pause. Then the sound of running water stopped. "I'm coming out," Percy said quietly. O'Connor returned to the station and laid out all the evidence he had gathered on the table. Photographs, witness statements, descriptions of the mysterious lover. Everything pointed to a man from the city's upper business circles who could afford a black BMW and expensive suits. The detective picked up the phone book and began compiling a list of construction companies in River City. One of them immediately caught his attention. Steelman Construction. He had seen their billboards all over town. Percy Steelman, O'Connor read aloud. Married, 2 children, member of the Chamber of Commerce. He went online and found a photo of Stillman on the company's website. The face looked familiar, the same as the photos from the victim's apartment. O'Connor took the photos and drove to Mrs. Gray's house. The elderly woman immediately identified Stillman as a frequent visitor to apartment 8B. Now the detective had a prime suspect. Detective O'Connor arrived at the Stillman Construction office on Tuesday morning. The 30-story river tower rose above the business district, symbolizing the success of its owner. The secretary led the detective into a spacious office with panoramic windows. Percy Stillman sat at a massive oak desk, but the documents in front of him remained untouched. When O'Connor entered, he looked up, and the detective saw in his eyes the deep fatigue of a man who had not slept all night. "Mr. Stillman, I'm Detective O'Connor. I'm investigating the murder of Jason Reyes." Percy nodded slowly. "I've been expecting you." O'Connor placed photographs from the victim's apartment on the desk. "Did you know Mr. Reyes?" "Yes, we'd been seeing each other for a year and a half." Percy's voice sounded lifeless. "Was he blackmailing you?" "He demanded $50,000 by Sunday, threatening to tell everyone about our relationship." O'Connor took out his notebook. "Where were you on Sunday evening?" A long pause. Percy stared out the window at the city that no longer felt like home. "I went to his place," he said quietly, "around 10:30. "Tell me what happened." Percy closed his eyes. "I tried to explain that I couldn't get that kind of money without my wife noticing. Stacy controls all our accounts. I offered him $20,000, all the cash I could get. How did he react?" He laughed. He said $20,000 wouldn't save him from the debt collectors. If I didn't find $50,000, he'd call the River City Times tomorrow and tell them all about Percy Stillman's secret life. Percy stood up and walked over to the window. "You know, Detective, I was willing to lose everything for him. I was willing to leave my wife, my children, my business, and start a new life in another city. But he didn't want that. All he wanted was the money." "What happened then?" "I begged him to wait another week to give me some time. But he said he'd already got a better job offer in San Francisco. But he needed money for the move and startup capital." Percy's voice trembled. "It turned out that a year and a half of our relationship meant less to him than the opportunity to open a restaurant on the West Coast." "And then you killed him?" Percy turned to the detective. "Number. That's when I realized I never knew him, that I loved a man who didn't exist." He returned to the table and sat down. Jason started gathering some documents, saying we had nothing left to talk about. He turned his back to me and I saw that heavy vase on the table. "How many times did you hit him?" "Once. He fell right down and didn't move." Percy clenched his hands into fists. I stood over his body and thought about how he had never once said he loved me in a year and a half. He always talked about the future, money, dreams. And I thought we were building something real. O'Connor wrote down every word. "What did you do after you hit him?" "I panicked. I tried to make it look like a robbery. I turned the furniture over, opened the drawers, but I didn't touch the TV or the computer. Too heavy, and there would have been fingerprints." Percy smiled bitterly. "I'm a lousy criminal." "Then you went home?" "Yes. Stacy was asleep. I took a shower and lay down next to her, thinking about how I had become a murderer." He looked up at the detective. "You know what the worst part is? I don't regret that he's dead. I only regret that I killed him." An hour later, Percy Stillman was arrested. At the mansion in Oakland Hills, Stacy was greeting the children from school when she saw police cars outside the house. "Mom, what's going on?" asked 14-year-old Emily, seeing her father being led away in handcuffs. Stacy hugged her daughter, unable to find the words. All she could say was, "Daddy did a very bad thing." In his prison cell, Percy sat on a narrow cot and thought about how his life had fallen apart in a matter of days. Tomorrow morning, the whole town would know the truth about him, about his secret life, and that he was a murderer. Thomas Harris learned of the arrest on the evening news. At his trial 4 months later, Percy Stillman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. His lawyer asked the court to consider the emotional stress and lack of premeditation, but the judge was unmoved. "Mr. Stillman, you killed a man to hide your secret," he said as he handed down the sentence. 18 years in prison. Stacy filed for divorce before the trial. The children moved in with her parents in a neighboring state. Stillman Construction was sold to pay off debts. Detective O'Connor closed the case. In the small world of River City, secrets had a price, and sometimes that price was too high.